Hello, AP Psychology students. Let's talk language. Most of you have probably heard of Helen Keller before. If not, she was a person who lived in the 20th century who was born normal, but then she had scarlet fever, and as a result of her illness, she lost both her ability to hear and her ability to see, starting at about the age of 18 months. So imagine your life without language. Language is one of those things that we just that does so much for us. It helps us to express and to remember and to talk about our feelings and to share ideas. And without language, at the age of 6, Helen Keller was literally pounding her head on the wall. And if you read this quote, if you pause and read this quote, you'll see that she really did not have a sense of past or future. And when I read about Helen Keller as a girl in grade school, I remember reading that she talked about when she discovered language, her soul came alive. She says here, when a little word from the fingers of another fell into my hand, that clutched at emptiness, and my heart leaped to the rapture of living. Night fled before the day of thought, and love and joy and hope came up in a passion of obedience to knowledge. I encourage you to go to Schoology and to watch the video of Anne Sullivan, how she describes how she taught Helen Keller, who could not hear and could not see, how to talk and how to learn language. This is a picture of her in the top corner, and she is actually putting her thumb on the larynx of President Eisenhower, and then she puts her finger on his nose and her other fingers on his cheek. And by doing this, she can understand what he's saying. She really was remarkable. So we're going to talk about language today, and we're going to begin with just some basics. First of all, language is just a symbol, whether it's written or spoken, it's just symbolic. It's a symbol that represents meaning. Now, this picture here is from a book, and I'm not going to go through it, but it's from a book that was produced by the publishing company to help parents understand what it was like for their children to learn to read. And it's actually kind of a strange story. It's about this boy. Here's Sam, and Sam is trying to shoot the duck. It's just a rubber duck, thankfully. And we go through each page and we learn a new letter of these symbols. And eventually the idea is that we can read the book. But again, we see by going through it that it is something that is completely arbitrary. The fact that this is an S, that's an A, and that's an M, or this is S-A-M, is completely arbitrary. It has no implicit or inherent meaning. So how is language structured? First of all, phonemes. Phonemes are the smallest speech units that we can both produce and perceive. So if you think of something like cha, ba, ka, ta, etc., those are phonemes. Now, this is a phonemic chart, and back when I was a kid, if we looked in the dictionary, we would actually see these symbols, and they are still used to describe how a word is pronounced. So this symbol right here is like the from book, okay? This one right here is two, so it's oo. It's the oo from two. That's how you would say those letters. Now, if you think to your language, your primary language that you speak, it may or may not be English. You may speak 2 languages or 3, or I've had students that are quadrilingual, which is like absolutely amazing to me. Of all of the human languages, there are approximately 800 different speech sounds. That's pretty remarkable. And if you do speak another language, I'd like you to pause actually and see if you can think of some phonemes that you maybe say in a different language that you don't say in English. I took Danish, for example, in college, and there's a like a very deep guttural sound in Danish that we don't have in English. English only has 40 phonemes, so all the words that we have are made up of only 40 phonemes. Most languages have 40 to 60. Now, we put together those phonemes and we make morphemes. morphemes are the smallest units of meaning. So English has about 100,000 morphemes. And if we look at this example here, friend is the root word, un is the prefix, and li is the suffix. So the morphemes, each of the morphemes changes the meaning of the word in some way, or its usage, or its tense. Phrases are two or more words that comprise a unit of a sentence. And then, of course, sentences are a grammatical unit that contain both a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And you're far enough along in school now that you know what a noun phrase and a verb phrase are. So what is grammar? Well, there are two parts to grammar. First of all, there are semantics. These are general rules used to derive meaning from morphemes, words, and sentences. For example, if you add ed to a word, that would make it past tense. So laugh or laughed, past tense. I laughed at the TV show last night. Now, syntax are the rules for the arrangement of words in sentences, the noun phrase and the verb phrase, and the rules of syntax that we learn naturally as we learn a language as we're growing up. Now, when we learn a language later, the rules of syntax can be more difficult to learn. In fact, that is one of the hardest things oftentimes for someone to master in a language that they're learning after their initial language are the rules of syntax for the new language. I actually started reading a book this week that was translated from Danish to English, and I've noticed some syntactical problems with the book. It's actually kind of bugging me, so I don't think I'm going to finish it. And not that I think that, the Danish person should have to have a perfectly translated English book, but that is what happens in translation sometimes. So syntax, every language has it, and every language has a noun phrase and verb phrase. So how do we develop? Well, language is so important, starts so early, from 3 to 10 months of age. This is our pre-linguistic cooing and babbling. What's super cool about this time period is if you listen to a 3-month-old baby, they are actually using all of the phonemes that they are hearing in their household. And if they're in a daycare, perhaps with another language, they're going to just seamlessly maintain the phonemes for both the language that they use at home and the one that they're hearing at daycare. Now, a problem happens if someone is prohibited from cooing and babbling. For example, if they have, and this is a practice that I've heard of happening, if they have a pacifier taped to their mouth, they don't get to practice crying out loud. So the vocal cords don't get practice. They don't get to practice the way that you would move your tongue and your lips and your jaw in order to make specific phonemes. And so this could lead to lifelong problems with language development. Now, children generally understand their first words at 7 to 8 months, and by far, the earliest words are mama and dada, which are pretty much said the same way in all languages. It's some variant of mama or papa or mama and dada. There is a video that I'm not going to be showing on here. Deaf babies do babble. Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Yes. So at 10 to 13 months, the child will generally speak its first words. Parents are often so excited to hear this, and it really is an amazing thing to start to hear your child speak. By 18 months, the average productive vocabulary, this means how many words a child can produce, is somewhere between 3 words and 50 words. Now, I can tell you from experience with my own 4 children, at 18 months, my youngest child, I think he spoke 3 or 4 words at 18 months. My oldest child, we were a little worried about him because of some birth complications, so we actually wrote down all the words that he could say at 18 months, and he could say 250 words. So, in the long run, if you talk to my two sons, you would not know that one of them spoke 3 words at 18 months and one spoke 250 words at 18 months. They caught up with my younger one caught up. The thing is, for 18-month-olds, is they have a very large receptive vocabulary. They understand a lot more than they can actually produce. And this is why you start to see things like temper tantrums. So from 18 to 24 months, we have what's called telegraphic speech. So we will hear a child at this age give a noun and a verb, in this case a verb and a noun, give doll. And they're clearly able to communicate meaning. And then they do something called fast mapping, which is extraordinary to watch and to listen to. Children will map a word onto a concept. So we've talked about concepts, right, like a chair. They'll map a word onto a concept after only one exposure. And it is amazing. Their language just takes off. Children overgeneralize syntax rules. So these verbs like go or eat, they'll put like goed or eated or thinked. So it's the irregular verbs primarily that are overgeneralized. In grade school, by first grade, a child is speaking 10,000 words. By fifth grade, 40,000 words, and most adults speak somewhere from 60 to 80,000 words. And of course, that includes all of the variations of the root word, the prefix, and the suffix that can change the meaning of the word. In about third, fourth grade, we achieve something called metalinguistic awareness. This is when we're able to reflect on our speech. We can understand things like puns and jokes and sarcasm. And I tell you what, a lot of high school teachers would really have a hard time teaching little kids because they really like to use sarcasm. And the thing is that if you try to use sarcasm with a child who has not reached metalinguistic awareness yet, they will think you're serious. And sometimes it can actually hurt their feelings because that's how sarcasm works sometimes. So why do we acquire language? The behaviorists would say, Skinner being the primary example, that we learn through reinforcement. Our mother and father and caregivers will respond to our speech when we say something correctly. If we say something incorrectly, the parent, if the child said, for example, I go to grandma's, then the parent would say, you should say, I went to grandma's. That's what the behaviorists would say. But most people don't really believe that we learn language through reinforcement. Chomsky's the guy. He's the name you want to know. That kind of sounds like Chomsky, like you're chomping on something, but his name is Noam Chomsky, and he is the guy. He's the one that you're going to study if you study linguistics in college. He talks about something called a language acquisition device, or LAD for short. He suggests, and research has actually confirmed, that there is an innate mechanism that facilitates the learning of language. It's like sitting and walking. People will learn language. And in fact, an interesting phenomenon is twins actually tend to learn a language and develop language that can communicate with each other. And they'll eventually lose that language. But we're basically wired to communicate. All languages have the same grammatical building blocks, in other words, a noun and a verb. And so he calls this universal grammar. If you study linguistics further, there is something called deep structure, which is the overall meaning of a sentence. And then the surface structure is the construction of it. So if, for example, you said the sentence, the mother kissed her daughter. Hello. You could also say the daughter was kissed hello by her mother, or something along that line. But we get the impression that the mother is greeting her daughter with a kiss. And that's what the underlying meaning is, or the deep structure. Then we have the linguistic relativity hypothesis. This was hypothesized by, it's also called the Sapir-Whorf theory. And what this suggests is that the structure of a language and its concepts of the world actually affects the way in which an individual thinks. I've asked my multilingual students, when they're thinking in a different language than English, do they actually think or view things differently? So, for example, in American English, we have many, many words that are self-adulating. We tend to like ourselves and we compliment ourselves a lot, even to ourselves. But in some other languages, in Japanese, for example, there are more self-deprecating words. That idea of humility is very important. And so if someone's thinking in American English versus Japanese, they might be thinking about themselves differently depending on the language that they are thinking in or speaking in, for that matter. So this quote here, just linguistic determinism, this is the idea that every human language reflects the values of the place and the culture where it originated. And the philosophers and linguists have long debated how this affects and shapes the mentality of persons who speak those different languages. So the way that this has been studied is actually by looking at the number of words, for example, in different languages that describe something like snow, or the number of words that describe something like self-concept. And by looking at those words and the number of words in those different languages, we can see how the language might affect your thinking. So the critical period hypothesis was hypothesized by a man named Eric Lenenberg. And he would suggest that you must learn language before puberty, or you won't be able to. And the only way that we could study this, possibly, is through something called feral children. And feral children bring up a point of questions where we think, how does one think and communicate without language? And what is it that makes us human? And is language part of that? So I am not going to be showing a feral language or feral children video, but I will link one on Schoology if you're interested. So feral children are called the forbidden experiment because you would never intentionally put a child in the conditions that these children were in. So Victor is the name of the person in the top picture. He was isolated in the wild in France. And when he was found at about the age of 12, he knew how to survive in the woods of France. He could kill a wolf. He had fingernails that were long and very, very thick. And so somebody tried to work with him, a man named Charcot tried to work with him, but he was never able to get him to fully communicate using language. Another type of feral child, and this one is really hard to grasp, are those that are raised by animals. And there are a surprising number of feral children's stories of children raised by animals. The picture on the right is of Amala and Kamala. And these are two girls that were found by a missionary in India. Their story is well documented, as are cases of other infants that have been found primarily with canines, and they most likely suckled from them as well. And so they learn the barks and the growls of the animals that they live with, but depending on the age when they're found, it's quite difficult to train them or teach them language. There is a girl named Oksana Malaya in the Ukraine, and she was raised by dogs, and she was able to learn a fair amount of language and actually be able to reflect back on the time when she was living with the dogs and had no language. So that was really extraordinary. And then finally we have a very tragic situation. This is Jeannie on the bottom. And I used to show her story in class, but it is really quite depressing. She was horrifically abused by her parents. She was confined in a room. She was tied to a potty chair. She had chicken wire on top of her crib until she was 13 years old when she was finally brought to public attention. And she had 2 rows of teeth. She spit. She didn't know how to talk. And the psychologists that worked with her never were really able to achieve any kind of meaningful language from her. So these children do teach us something, but again, they are the forbidden experiment. But they do point to evidence that we need to learn a primary language by the time we reach puberty. So thank you for your attention, um, and have a great day. Good night.